Mental Health and Climate Change Alliance, we are a community of researchers, of healthcare providers, community organizers, and people who are generally interested in looking at the intersection of mental health and climate change. And what we're trying to do here is identify and address the adverse impacts of the climate crisis on mental health. This summit is really a place for us to share what's happening both provincially, nationally, and internationally in this area. So we're welcoming people from community groups as well as from academic environments as well. And we're generously sponsored by PICS, which stands for Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions. And I highly suggest you check out their website. They do a lot of really great work and are really situating themselves as at the forefront of a lot of practical climate solutions. So have a look there. So today, Tuesday, February 4th, is the beginning of the summit, and we start with a panel on transnational solidarities and BIPOC youth perspectives on climate mental health. And then at 10:30, we're going to go to some interactive poster presentations, and we'll be giving you instructions how to visit different rooms and how to interact with people, hopefully seamlessly. At 11 o'clock, we'll be having more presentations on climate impacts on mental health and well-being. And then at 12, we have a workshop looking at mindfulness. And then at 12:30, we have another workshop. So hopefully you stay for the whole day. We look forward to having you there. Okay, and I will just, I hope that you have an opportunity here over the next few days. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. 3 or 4 years in, I still can't get Zoom straight. I'm joined today by Kaylee Higgs, our project lead extraordinaire from the Mental Health and Climate Change Alliance. And she may be the person who you've been interacting with the most. So she's a familiar face to many people. And we're very lucky to have Janelle Lapointe join us this morning to give us a land acknowledgement. Janelle Lapointe is an Afro-Indigenous climate justice and Indigenous rights organizer from the Stellatan First Nation. She's currently a senior advisor at the David Suzuki Foundation and a guest on Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam territories. Janelle also previously organized with Common Horizon, was a regular contributor on CBC Vancouver's The Early Edition Climate Panel. She's currently a member of the Indigenous Climate Adaptation Working Group, council member of 7Gen Energy, and an instructor of Simon Fraser University's Foundations in Climate Action course. She leans on her lived experience growing up on her small reserve in northern British Columbia to ensure that intersectionality is at the forefront of environmental narratives, to build power and help others to see their stake in fighting back against the status quo. Welcome, Janelle.
Thank you, Alexis. Hadi Zenhunzu, Bunadahunzu, Suzy, Janelle Lapointe, Stellatan, Inkez, Luxoyu Asli, Atsu, and Emma Baker, Atien, and Willie Baker, Alu, and Michelle Baker, Abba, and Renee Lapointe, Stella Kea, Hubo Yangkat, Etspa, Ninja Nasya. Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Janelle Lapointe. I am from the Stellatan First Nation, Caribou Clan, and yeah, today I'm calling in from my home territory here in the village of Stella on unceded Dakat territory, located in the northern interior of so-called British Columbia. And I acknowledged my Dakat grandmother, my Black and Choctaw grandfather, the late Willie Baker, as well as my parents as part of protocol. Thank you so much for having me. Today is my first day back to work after my winter holidays back on my reserve. This has become my own little way of fighting back against the capitalist and colonial mindset of the new year, which falls in the dead of winter, by continuing to honor my body and rest and the natural cycles by taking a holiday later in the winter than most people do, which is something I'm immensely privileged to be able to do. But I hope that I can continue and that you can all continue finding ways to do that for yourselves and your loved ones over the next month and a bit as we head towards the spring equinox. I look forward to sharing a bit more about my homelands once we transition to the panel. And since we're gathering in an online format today, I would like you all to reflect on the lands that you're on, that you're calling into from today. And I know we've all heard a lot of acknowledgements. Some of you have probably given several land acknowledgements. And so today I'm grateful that the organizers, gave a lot of spaciousness to me to take my time with the land acknowledgement, because it's really important that these things don't become repetitive and that we continually reflect on what we mean as we acknowledge the land. Today, I acknowledge my ancestors, my matrilineal line in the opening. And I know how each of those named are connected to lands. My grandmother comes from a long line of hereditary chiefs and was born on the very river that still flows from my community. And today she continues to be a Dakat elder, a language teacher, a knowledge holder. My grandfather comes from a stolen people whose ancestors were forced across the Atlantic via the slave trade and forced into violent racist conditions in the southern states of America. My grandfather went on to have many children, naming several of them after African freedom fighters, and carrying on the tradition of my great-grandmother, who was a Choctaw member of her community. My father, whose French ancestors violently displaced and disrupted the ways of life of a nomadic boreal indigenous people, quite similar to my own kin, had to learn his place as he became integrated in the community of Stella. And my mother is a strong advocate and still lives and works in the community of Stella today. I invite you to reflect on the stories you hold. If you said aloud the true name, the original name of the land you're on, and the names that you know in your family line, what relationships would it reveal? And we do this remembering not for reasons of guilt or shame or monotony, but as protocol, as resolve, and for hope for something better. Remember this each time you hear or do a land acknowledgement. A land acknowledgement is a political assertion of Indigenous sovereignty. And if we know how we have benefited, participated in, or fought against the ongoing cultural genocide of Indigenous people, then we know better and get to be better by the land and by the people. To further this, I invite you all to take a moment to do a short meditation or reflection or grounding. Invite you to close your eyes, lower your gaze, perhaps just stand still for a moment and take a deep breath. And I invite you to bring to mind someone who played a big role in carving out a path for you to be here, to be well, to be safe, to thrive. Perhaps this person is someone directly in your family lineage, or perhaps it's someone or a group of people that you have never directly met. Humans who fought for the freedom, safety, and dignity that you experience today. Who are they? What do they look like? What motivated them to work so hard to create a better life for you? What struggles were they going through? What kind of life were they yearning for? And how are you living part of the life they dreamed and worked towards? Sit with that for a moment, for a breath. And now I invite you to let your mind travel forward in time. Imagine someone you love. Perhaps this is a child in your life now, or someone you have yet to meet. someone living in the future, 30 or 50 years from now. Maybe they're your age or younger, growing into a world that you helped shape. Who are they and what do they look like? What do you long for them? What is the freedom, joy, and justice you deeply hope that they will experience? What world do you imagine for them? What kind of land do you hope they will walk on? What kind of air will they breathe? How will they be connected to their surroundings, their community, and their ancestors? As we do this visioning, you can imagine, you can sense the land holding you, just as it held those before you. Their footsteps, their dreams, their sacrifices, all remembered by the land. And just as the land carries them, it will carry those you imagined in the future. So with your final breath, you can express some gratitude for the land and the communities who have protected it. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes, wiggle your toes, take a stretch, and I welcome you back into the space. Remembering that the land is not separate from our stories. It's a thread that ties us to the past and to the future. And what we do today leaves an imprint just as those who lived before us did. So remember that this acknowledgement is a political assertion. It's an invitation to do better by the land, better by the people, in protocol, with resolve, and with hope. So I hope that grounding had you ready for the day and for the rest of the summit. Thank you for indulging me, Awatse, and thank you for having me. I'll pass it back to the organizers.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that beautiful land acknowledgement, Janelle. It really helps us center us for the day and remind us why we're here and why we're doing this work. And what a great bridge to our opening panel. Naomi Leung will be joining us now to moderate our opening panel on transnational solidarities and BIPOC youth perspective on climate and mental health. This will be presented in partnership with the Climate Hub at the UBC. Sorry about that. UBC, and it will feature perspectives from BIPOC youth leaders on climate justice and mental health. The best way for people to ask questions is through the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. And this will help the moderator moderate. The chat will be open to share resources and also to introduce yourselves. If we find the chat is not being respectful, though, we will turn it off. And we'll be recording many of the sessions today, which can be found later on our YouTube channel. You'll hear the recording stopping and starting periodically in transitions between the panel, poster session, academic talks, and workshops today, just to support this recording. Welcome, Naomi.
Thank you so much, Alexis and Janelle. Yeah, my name is Naomi, and I really want to, echo a lot of what Janelle said. The climate movement has a responsibility to Indigenous and Global South communities who experience the brunt of climate injustices. We must continually learn more ways to take action beyond land acknowledgements and be accountable to the host nations whose territories that we live on. Yeah, I'm so honored to have organized and to be moderating our panel today. And yeah, here are some more resources if you want to take a look at them. The Yellowhead Institute also has a free course on land back, which I thought was really great to check out. And yeah, so alongside our the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, I also want to thank UBC Climate Hub and the Mental Health and Climate Change Alliance for partnering with us today. Yeah, my name is Naomi. My Chinese name is Leung Puyan. I'm honored to be the moderator, and I'm a work-learn student at the UBC Climate Hub and with the UBC Climate Wellbeing Sustainability Ambassadors. And so Yeah, so some motivations I had for today's event were noting how um, um, when I when faced with the realities of global and local systems of militarism, imperialism, colonial policing, occupation, genocides, and ecocides, the grief, overwhelm, and complex feelings I can see within in the youth around me and the youth that I work with. Also noting how oftentimes scapegoating onto minorities, migrant workers, and immigrants often happens. And so my hopes and desires for starting at this event and also continuing into the future is that we can treat eco-anxiety in their context of white supremacy, in the context of ongoing colonialisms. My hopes and desires are that cultural resistance and building a vision together for climate justice can not only be included, but also centered in the climate movement. My hopes are also to honor our ancestors and future generations through our grief, through our celebration, and also through our actions that we take together. And I also, yeah, feel so grateful for our speakers today who have taught me so much about what it means to put hope into practice, and moreover, about what it means to understand how environmental racism, white supremacy, anti-Blackness, medical racism, Indigenous sovereignty, migrant rights, displacement, and ableism are also mental health and climate injustice issues. So yeah, hopefully we can build those cross-movement solidarities and get organized together. Yeah, so today we'll explore as well concepts of critical and messy hope. As Miriam Kaba has said, hope is a discipline. And so, yeah, something I've really been exploring recently is about how hope is a messy and often contradictory process, but ultimately it's entangled with the body and land, as Carrie Green has said. It requires interruptions and invitations. It requires bearing witness to social and historical trauma, and it's not disconnected from our anger and grief. This is another cool resource I recommend checking out called Climate Doomed to Messy Hope, which has really informed my work as well, created by Megan Wise, the previous director of UBC Climate Hub. And yeah, so some housekeeping, grab a snack, grab a pen and paper, stretch, please listen to your body. Yeah, do what you need to do. Yeah, I also want to highlight how there is a difference between being unsafe and being uncomfortable. So I want to invite you to treat this space as a space for growth. We don't want it to be an unsafe space, but we do want it to be a space that is accountable to each other, and that can sometimes be difficult. But there's a difference between feeling uncomfortable and feeling unsafe. To be unsafe is to be experiencing violence or the threat of violence that compromises mental or physical well-being, whereas being uncomfortable, on the other hand, can encompass experiencing a feeling of self-consciousness or heightened sense of self-awareness, sometimes questioning right or wrong thinking. But I encourage you to notice if you're feeling uncomfortable. How does your breath feel? Are your muscles tense? How is your heart rate? I encourage you to notice and then accept and move towards the discomfort. Moving out of your comfort zone allows for growth and learning, and moving towards that vulnerability is really something that we invite you to do. We will do our best to set up a braver and caring space with some resources available. I also want to note how racialized and marginalized peoples are often forced to expend their emotional labor to maintain white comfort. And, today we're really here to disrupt that. And I think that continuous unlearning and exploring growth zones is really necessary for growth. So some themes for today is that we will explore questions like, what do we mean by climate justice? How do global capitalism and ongoing colonialisms relate to climate change? And how can we mobilize our privileges while living in the global north? What are our responsibilities? What does meaningful transnational solidarity look like? And how can we get organized and engage in care work? So these are difficult questions to contend with, and it's okay if you're feeling overwhelmed. It's normal to feel overwhelmed by climate change and by systems of oppression, but it's also important to note how we want to build a better world in which this is not the case. But we're here today to learn, get connected, build our skills, and we invite you to get organized. Through intergenerational coalition, international solidarity, community care, and education, we can build skills and resist together. So from Turtle Island to Palestine, to East Turkestan, to Tibet, to the Congo, to Sudan, to Haiti, to Hawaii, there's no climate justice without freedom for all oppressed peoples. Our liberations are connected, our histories are connected, and our futures are connected. So this is another cool webinar that I recommend checking out if you want to look at that resource. In terms of the structure of the event, I'm going to introduce our panelists one by one, and then we'll hear from them, and then also have a Q&A. And if you have questions for them, you can write them down or drop them into the chat, and I think you can upvote what questions you want to ask. Yeah, I'm gonna introduce Aydana first. So Aydana Turdy is an Uyghur first-generation settler on the occupied lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and is currently a political science and sociology student at the University of British Columbia. Aydana is passionate about organizing for social justice and addressing misinformation about the Uyghur genocide in leftist and progressive spaces, which is informed by her life experience as a queer Uyghur person whose family has been incarcerated and persecuted by the Chinese colonial state. Aydana is also interested in the intersections of issues of forced Uyghur labor and fast fashion and how colonialism and the climate crisis are deeply interconnected. Yeah, welcome.
Hi, thanks so much, Naomi, for that beautiful introduction. And hi, everyone. I'm so excited and honored to be here today. And so, yeah, like Naomi said, you can call me Dana, but my Uyghur name is Aydana. It was given to me by my grandfather, and I mean moon in Uyghur. And moon is kind of like a term of endearment for the Uyghur people. And so, yeah, I just think it's really sweet. And I'm trying to kind of go by that name more. And yeah. And so today I'll be talking a little bit about kind of like my personal experiences with colonialism and occupation, and how that might look a little different from kind of what's in like the mainstream, and as well as kind of how that illustrates like the Uyghur experience with colonialism, occupation, and resource exploitation, which is kind of at the heart of global capitalism today. And a little bit about the greenwashing of the Uyghur genocide as well. And so I'm going to try to share my screen. Hopefully this works. Okay. So, hopefully these slides are like a good visual aid for everyone. So you don't have to just hear me talk. Oh, I think I'll be, there we go. Can everyone see that? Okay, awesome. So yeah, just to give a little introduction to who the Uyghurs are, if you might not know. The Uyghurs are a Central Asian Turkic people currently residing in China. And so the Uyghurs have like a long and rich history of living along the Silk Road and in Central Asia, and have, like I said, dealt with ongoing colonialism and occupation since around the 1940s. The Uyghurs have managed to kind of have like brief statehood during the 1900s, the latest being the East Turkestan Republic in the 1930s. And so, but now, after Chinese colonialism and the region is now named Xinjiang, or which is short for kind of like the full name, which is the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. So yeah, the region is now kind of dealt with the same way that kind of the Chinese state designates kind of like the Tibetan region and Hong Kong. And so technically, we're supposed to have our own autonomous governance, but as you'll see, this is not the case in reality. And yeah, so the Uyghur people share a lot of cultural similarities with other Central Asian people, like the Uzbek, Kazakh, and Kyrgyz people. Yeah, I have been really lucky to be able to kind of learn more about my culture and my language recently, but this is continuously under threat, as I'll talk a little bit more about later. And this is, you can see on the screen as well, that's the flag of the East Turkestan Republic, which is also a symbol of Uyghur activism as well. Yeah, and so I'm going to start off talking a little bit about my own personal story. And on the screen, you can see photos of my family. And so on the left are my great grandparents, so my grandmother's parents. And in the middle is my grandmother with my uncle and my mother. And on the right, my mother's parents, as well as my dad's mother as well. And these are all taken in East Turkestan. Oh, I think I forgot to mention this earlier, but East Turkestan is kind of a term that Uyghur activists like to use for the Xinjiang region. And so yeah, that's for, I'll just be using East Turkestan for this presentation. So yeah, I was born in East Turkestan, and I immigrated to Canada when I was 2 years old. And throughout my childhood, we would always go kind of back home and visit family. And so it's essentially like a second home to me. But in 2019, we heard the news that my uncle was imprisoned, and we had kind of been hearing kind of news coming out of the region for a little bit of different people having their families incarcerated without like any kind of reason, and just like very suddenly. But obviously this still came as like a huge shock to my family. Yeah, and I mean, I think this is like, I don't even have to say this, but my uncle was like a law-abiding citizen. And yeah, there was just no reason that was apparent for his imprisonment. So at the same time, my grandfather was diagnosed with kind of late stage lung cancer. So we went back to East Turkestan to kind of see him, and my mom took care of him for several months while my uncle was still imprisoned. So while we were there, my grandfather sadly passed away, and my uncle didn't get to see him before his passing, which was really devastating for our family as well. And shortly after, kind of my mother went to kind of the Chinese government offices and kind of demanded his release, which was, I think, a very badass move on her part. But I think that, you know, because we're Canadian citizens, were offered a certain degree of kind of privilege in being able to go back home and kind of having some voice as well. And so my mother kind of threatened to go to kind of like to journalists and like the Canadian government. And my uncle was kind of shortly released after that, just like in the middle of the night. And this photo in the middle was taken shortly after his release. And so he lost a lot of weight while he was in prison. And yeah, and I don't think we really know the extent of his conditions there, but from other kind of evidence and what's been coming out, the conditions are really, really awful. Yeah, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. And so we actually found out recently about the kind of reason for his imprisonment, and it was because he sent my cousin, so his son, to a religious like Muslim school. Yeah, and like reasons like that are kind of very common for many kind of prison sentences and incarcerations that are ongoing in China. And so yeah, I know that's a really kind of heavy thing to sit with, but I hope that gives like a personal voice to kind of the context that I'll be talking about. And so in 2014, China officially kind of launched its Strike Hard Against Violent Terrorism campaign. This was kind of in the context, like after 9/11, kind of this like global move to designate certain racialized people as like terrorists, especially people who practice Islam. China kind of used this opportunity to deal with what they kind of called the Uyghur problem. Uyghurs had been advocating and protesting against Chinese occupation for years, which led to many kind of violent protests and kind of face-offs between the Uyghur people and the Chinese police. This photo is from one of those protests. Yeah, and to kind of stifle this kind of like growing unrest in the region, China started incarcerating many Uyghurs, and now kind of experts say that it's over 1 million Uyghurs who are still incarcerated in what China has called re-education camps, to kind of in what they call to deal with like the kind of terrorist mindset, which they've kind of likened to a disease that needs to be eradicated and kind of treated. Yeah, and so along with kind of mass incarcerations, there's been obviously like kind of mass surveillance and policing of the Uyghur people. Many Uyghurs have had their passports just completely taken away, which means they cannot leave the region. My own family does not have access to their passports right now, and they need to kind of apply to receive their passports back, which is a strategy to kind of like tamp down on many Uyghurs that were kind of like fleeing the region as like refugees, or like a lot of Uyghurs around the world that are trying to claim kind of status as refugees. Yeah, and along with that, there's been kind of bans on cultural and religious practices. And so Uyghurs are like a majority Muslim people, but now this is largely forbidden in the region. And so my own family members have kind of had to pray in kind of secret in the middle of the night. Before, it was kind of common to see women wearing headscarves, like in this photo. But this is also banned. And when my mother and I went back for like my grandfathers and my grandmother who passed away recently for their funerals. It's kind of like, a sign of respect to like cover your hair and wear a headscarf. But then the police told us that that was not allowed, we had to take them off. And I'm assuming it's much worse for the people who are residing there. And so kind of connecting this issue with the topic of the summit, with like climate change and resource exploitation, something that I think is really important to talk about is how we are complicit as consumers, and how businesses are profiting off of the situation and off of forced labor and incarceration. And so a lot of evidence has come out that many Uyghurs are coerced and forced to work in kind of labor transfers where they are either transferred to other regions in China or within East Turkestan itself to work on, work in different industries. And something that I want to talk about today is the complicity of kind of like the fashion industry. Fast fashion is obviously horrible for the environment itself, and I don't think I have to really talk much about that, but also there are these like awful labor practices that are associated with fast fashion and kind of marketplaces like Temu, for example. And so Shein and Temu are like the most egregious examples, but retailers like Zara, H&M have also been found to source their materials from East Turkestan. So East Turkestan actually accounts for 23% of the world's cotton supply. And the region is kind of rich with different natural resources, which the Chinese kind of colonial state has been continuously exploiting since its occupation. Not only is the fashion industry complicit, but I also want to talk a little bit about the kind of greenwashing that's happening. And so with like the renewable energy industry, I think there's been like a large call to shift to renewable resources, which I think is great. But I think we should be really critical of where these materials are coming from, and to not be complicit in the exploitation of people as well. And so a report came out recently about the solar panel industry. And so East Turkestan also accounts for 45% of the world's supply of polysilicon, which is a key component to the making of solar panels. So I think that, like I said, we have to be really critical of where these materials are coming from. And forced labor is so widespread in the region that basically all materials coming out of East Turkestan are considered tainted with forced labor, because there is just like no transparency as to the supply chains and the conditions of workplaces there. And then kind of another example of greenwashing that I want to show is a kind of exchange or go global exchange program that's happening at my own university, UBC And so forestry students can partake in what's called Contemporary Forestry and Conservation in China, which is being held this summer. And they're actually going to East Turkestan and seeing how urban forestry works there and conservation works there, which completely glosses over all of the human rights abuses and ongoing occupation of the Uyghur people.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dana. I'm sorry, we do need to transition to the next panelist, but I would love for you to share more about this maybe during the Q&A. Yeah, I'm very excited to introduce the next panelist. Dani Beyene is a Black queer multidisciplinary artist, propagandist, curator, disability justice advocate, harm reducer, and mask block organizer of Gurage and Amara descent. Their relationship to what the Anishinaabe called Turtle Island is one of Black dispossession, displacement, and a commitment to land back. They are the visionary of Black Void UBC campaign for the investment and expansion of the UBC African Studies, demanding a formal apology for the institution historical and present anti-Blackness at UBC. In addition, they are the lead organizer of the mutual aid, social, and self-therapy chapter based on what is colonially known as Vancouver as a means of anarcho-nihilist abolition and disability justice practices. They are a senior research assistant in Dr. Lauren Emberson's Climate Justice Lab, in which they advocate for the abandonment of cruel optimisms and environmental justice efforts with no futures, encouraging the embrace of hopelessness in pursuit of pure negation and joyous. Welcome, Dani.
Hi. Sorry, I'm just like trying to see everything right now. Hi, I'm Dani. I'll just get right into what I have to say. Yeah, okay, so I don't have any slides, so I'll just be speaking to everyone. My story is, it begins in Ethiopia. I am of Gurage and Amhara descent, which are two ethnic groups within what is presently understood as Ethiopia. My father fled or was fleeing the Red Terror of the Derg regime in Ethiopia during the 70s and 80s. He did not leave Ethiopia during that time, but he was on the run and he did have to leave his parents while fleeing military siege. Everyone was fleeing during that time because there was a lot of just scrutiny towards anyone who did not identify themselves with the authoritarian communist regime. So it was just a very scary time for everyone. As he was around like in his early teens when he was fleeing or just like on the run, he had to stay with a distant aunt in like the countryside of Ethiopia, being that like his parents, my grandparents at the time, ended up being arrested because my grandfather was questioned for his children's resistance efforts against the Derg regime, which is very complicated and somewhat funny in retrospect, I guess, for me. But yeah, it was a very intense and scary time for many people on my father's side of my family. And on my mother's side was very connected to the roots that the Italians established during their failed attempts of colonizing Ethiopia. yeah, I think that situation is a very complicated and understudied thing in regards to Ethiopia, being that Ethiopia won the war, they won Adwa, but there was still the I guess the opportunities to exploit, the opportunities to still build what a colonial institution would want that were established in Ethiopia. And unfortunately, my mother's side of the family was subjected to that. Yeah, and what brought me to what the Anishinaabe call Turtle Island was was as a result of my oldest uncle from my mother's side fleeing Ethiopia due to the political unrest in which he was basically in fear trying to leave Ethiopia because it's a very traumatizing journey. Yeah. And the next question or prompt is, how has climate change impacted me or has impacted me? I would say that climate change for many people, including myself, has pushed me towards hopelessness. The only thing is that I would say that for myself, the hopelessness is not something that is burdening. It has motivated me to pursue jouissance and revenge because there are people that are responsible for the circumstances that we are in and that we are accelerating towards. And I don't think that it is something to be just idle in regards to. I think that the hopelessness is more so towards, or like my hopelessness is more so towards the fact that, it's kind of arguable to say that it's a fact, but the understanding that there is not going to be a global revolution and that global climate change is unstoppable. And I am somewhat, I am somewhat disillusioned with the idea of global revolution in regards to preventing climate change. I think that we have reached a point where we can witness climate change and its effects. Like, it is no longer something that we can proactively prevent, but something that we can react towards, as in organizing to prevent further harm that's already been subjected to the vulnerable communities that are often subjected to those harms. A book that that's like very influential to me and inspiring to me is the book Desert, which I'll read a quote that I'm looking at here. It says that global anarchist revolution is not going to happen. Global climate change is now unstoppable. Yet to be disillusioned with global revolution / with our capacity to stop climate change should not alter our nature or the love of nature we feel. There are many possibilities for liberty and wildness still. What are some of these possibilities and how can we live them? What could it mean to be an environmentalist when global revolution and worldwide social / eco sustainability are not the aim? What objectives, what plans, what lives, what adventures are there when the illusions are set aside and we walk into the world not disabled by disillusionment, but unburdened by it. And this is something that I think has a lot of potential in a sense, but that is just me, I guess. Yeah, and that's really how it's impacted me and my emotions, or just like how I make sense of everything in the world around us. I would say that climate injustice has impacted my homelands and my family. I do have a limited understanding because I do not live in Ethiopia, unfortunately. I would say that presently there is a lot of impact due to droughts and increased floodings due to the changes within the patterns of the rainy seasons. The rainy seasons in Ethiopia used to be so much more stable, I would say, and less drastic is the word that I'm looking for. And so now these rainy seasons, the saturation of them or the lack of their presence ends up resulting in droughts, increased flooding, and being that many people in Ethiopia rely on agriculture and keeping livestock to sustain their livelihoods and to just live their lives, there ends up resulting in increases in costs of food and scarcity of food due to the floods. Transnational solidarity and I just want to make sure that I am not going into something that I'm not supposed to be going into. Naomi?
Yeah, we can maybe leave more time into the Q&A for that question, if that's okay.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, just want to make sure I'm not.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, I think Alexis already introduced Janelle, but I'll give a little bit of her description again. Janelle Lapointe is an Afro-Indigenous climate justice and Indigenous rights organizer from Stillatin First Nation. She's currently a senior advisor at the David Suzuki Foundation and a guest on Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam territories. And yeah, I'm so grateful that you're joining us on the panel. Welcome, Janelle.
Thank you. Hi again. Yeah, I guess if I want one takeaway from me is that I love my land and I love my family. So when I think about what it's like to know me, I think it's to know where I come from and who I come from. So I think my story really starts with my grandmother Emma, who's a really central figure and inspiration in my life. She grew up right here in my community, and my community would have historically been a temporary site. There was never a permanent village site. The lake that I live on would have been used for summer fishing, as my people were nomadic and traveled over the vast territory in this north central part of BC. But prior to the reserve being forced onto this location, my grandfather had already started living and tending to these lands. So I have kind of a deeper connection beyond just like where the Indian Act has relocated my people permanently. But my grandmother did something really, brave and unusual, and left my community after being forcibly removed to attend Kamloops Indian Residential School, where, of course, the original 215 children were found in grave sites. After graduating from there, she headed to Vancouver to pursue a teaching degree. And My community is really small. There's about right now 200 people that live on reserve. And so for her to pursue a life in the city was very unheard of people in her generation. And she said, you know, being in Vancouver, she might as well have been in another country because it was so foreign to her. And she met my grandfather, Willie Baker, while attending a dance in Washington State. And so also marrying outside of her culture was kind of unheard of and different. And so she moved down to New Mexico, where my grandfather, Willie Baker's family had lived, and bore 6 of his children, and was living and working as a nurse in a care aide until my grandfather was tragically killed, leaving my grandmother widowed with 6 children. The oldest was 12 and the youngest were twin babies. And because my grandmother's teaching degree didn't transfer to the United States, she decided that it would be best to move her and her children back to my home community in hopes that she would have more steady income and a home on the reserve that she had called home prior to being forcibly removed for residential school. So she took the train all the way from the bottom of the United States of America back to northern BC with all 6 of her children, not knowing how they would afford to get all the way, but they made it, only to find out that due to a clause in the Indian Act that was there until the 1980s that stripped the rights of Indigenous women for marrying outside of our culture. So this was an intentional Indian Act policy designed to remove our matriarchs from our governance system. We are a matrilineal culture where women would have been the leaders and the rights and names and clan holders. But because she had married a Black man, she was not able to live or work on the reserve that she called home. So that forced my grandmother into a very hard economic situation. And the settler school in the town of Fraser Lake, which is the white municipality closest to my homelands, at the time, the school in town was not taking Indigenous children. So despite, you know, my grandmother being a survivor of residential school, she had no other choice than to place all 6 of her children in Lejac residential day school in order to be able to work to afford a mortgage, which was not in the plan. So I'm really inspired, you know, by my grandmother, and really recognize that, you know, her story was, you know, a story of forced, racist, culturally genocidal policies in the Indian Act, many of which are still in play today. And because, you know, my mother and her siblings were all Black and Indigenous, there was also a lot of anti-Blackness that my older generation faced, as well as, of course, the hardships of attending Lejac Day School. Yeah, despite this all, you know, I feel really fortunate that my family was able to, yeah, overcome so many imaginable hurdles that have allowed me to, you know, now get to live on the land where my grandmother was born. And this is a place where I experienced a lot of freedom as a first generation of my family to not be subjected to residential school, and to, of course, have the cultural teachings and knowledge of my grandmother, who was able to hold on to so much despite it being forcibly removed from her in residential school. So I got to grow up with a lot of freedom of just, you know, running around my homelands. And I was a really shy and quiet kid, which meant I loved to spend a lot of time alone outside. And I think that gave me, you know, a really unique relationship and perspective on the land, and allowed me to practice just being really observant of the land and its many changes. So of course, this resulted in like a really beautiful admiration and connection to nature, but it also meant that I was kind of hyper aware of the changes being forcibly imposed on my lands and people. So for example, if I were to walk right behind me and look out the window, I would be able to see Highway 16, which is known as the Highway of Tears, where women, girls, and Two-Spirit people are disproportionately found missing and murdered in this province. And this highway was also, of course, forced through my territory, cutting off access from the community I now live in and the plot of land where my grandmother was born and my mother and her siblings were raised. That's a piece of land I can no longer access due to the imposition of the highway, and then later the Canadian Pacific and Canadian National Railways. Despite living in natural abundance, when settlers first arrived on these territories, many of them wrote and recorded just how abundant the nature and the people were. But still, my community has struggled with basic needs such as clean drinking water due to runoff from the molybdenum mine that's nearby, which resulted in arsenic poisoning in our water that was not discovered until I was about 8 or 9 years old, which means that there's, health impacts, high cancer rates, et cetera, in my community. Our lands have been overexploited time and time again by industry. Single-handedly, corporations have put sturgeon and wild salmon, species that used to be abundant and vital to our culture, onto the brink of collapse. Our forests have been altered by the terrible forestry practices that we have in the province, replacing strong ecosystems with monoculture crops in order to be milled for lumber. And yeah, now we have new industries in line for the next payout, which is the oil and gas industry, namely natural gas and the LNG industry that has most recently completed the Coastal GasLink pipeline, which many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with due to the Wet'suwet'ens people's very public and ongoing resistance to that project. And yet, despite the very visible impacts of industry on our community, the latest industries are now opposing their involvement in our community as economic reconciliation. So saying that Indigenous people now get to be partners on this project, something that they were not allowed to do until recently. And therefore that is like progress that should be celebrated, and that, puts communities like mine between a rock and a hard place, where in order to have critical infrastructure like our clean drinking water system that was not paid for by the federal government, despite the Liberal government's commitments to end drinking water bans across the country, we've had to pay for that with money from accepting industry projects. So you'll notice in my community that critical infrastructure such as our health center, the nearest hospital is 2 hours away. Language center, we only have 6 language speakers that are still alive in our community, and many of them are facing very serious health impacts right now. All those projects were paid for by the very industry that are destroying our land, putting us in kind of a perpetual cycle of poverty, independence, and without the injection of a climate movement or ordinary people really caring about cash back and reparations in order for Indigenous people to have the self-sufficiency, in order to get some of the wealth that was stolen from their lands back into communities, and without, of course, decisive action from our provincial and national governments. This really creates an opportunity for industries to act like the good guys. So I kind of have lived with that kind of witnessing, but it wasn't until a few years in university where I got the language to be able to describe all these relationships that were happening. And I found university really hard. I thought that I was going to kind of leave my community forever, get an education, get some job somewhere, climb the corporate ladder. I was really kind of living the dream that capitalism tells you is the key to success. But I found being away from my community really difficult because I was not near that kind of land and people and that relationship that I had as a child. And I remember being really, really homesick in my 3rd year of university. and attending an awards gala for our student union. And the elder doing the land acknowledgement was actually a Nakazli elder, so a community very close to mine. And she reminded me so much of my grandmother. Like, she was the same stature, she spoke in the same kind of intentional way, she talked with her hands, and she did this most beautiful land acknowledgement, really, talking about her responsibility as settlers and guests on the land. She was acknowledging even the creepy crawlies on the ground, to the fish in the sea, to the birds in the sky. And I remember being kind of really lost into it because it was reminding me of home in a time where I was very homesick. And when I opened my eyes, I saw that the elder had finished and was quickly being kind of moved off stage for taking too long in the land acknowledgement. And behind her came this $500,000 check from the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And everyone in the university was getting up and cheering. And that kind of like clicked for me, where I like literally saw an elder being removed to make way for this big corporate donation during a time when I knew the local Tecumseh and Secwepemc people were actively fighting Trans Mountain. So I saw this as a way of buying consent on behalf of the university, despite Indigenous opposition. And so, yeah, my perspective on climate justice and in fighting some of these major industries that continue to make so much wealth off the lands while leaving Indigenous people and working class people to suffer and really bear the brunt of the labor, as deeply connected with the removal of Indigenous people. And so after I finished university, I went home and I started I dealt with the kind of classic effects of climate change that now all of us in the province have some experience with. The summer of 2017, or 2018, sorry, we had the #1 and #2 worst wildfires in the country during a very bad wildfire season on either side of my community. And we weren't at risk of flame, so we weren't on the evacuation notice, but we were absolutely choked with smoke. There was one day I was working in our band office at 2 p.m. in the afternoon, and the sky went completely black. It looked like two in the morning because of smoke. And I witnessed how quickly the settler municipalities around us were getting quicker aid from the government, whereas our community, despite having large population of elders and children, so people that are more likely to suffer the health impacts of devastating air quality and smoke, we're not getting the care they need. And this continues to be a risk every summer after. We're always choked with smoke, and we're always wondering if the forest behind ours is going to be the next one. And of course, because they're all monocrops due to the forestry industry, these fires light fast and burn for a long time and can really travel very far. And so, yeah, I really see the interconnection between climate and Indigenous people. And I also, recognize that my community was forced onto a plot of land that is not ideal. Where all of our houses are built on floodplains, and all of the houses, like I said, are built in close proximity to these monocrop altered forests, which makes us more susceptible to climate impacts. And so, yeah, I really see my experience and work now of trying to, tell that story and make that connection. I see transnational solidarity is key because there is similar stories in all Indigenous populations across the entire world of, corporate greed and imperialism really altering land and people. And then, of course, colonial and settler governments' complicity in upholding those systems. And now that I am made a minority in my own homelands, Indigenous people are now only 2% of the population of Canada. I really see Indigenous allyship with Solidarities for Struggle globally as our key to success. And I know, the climate movement had a really strong moment in 2019 where millions of people were in the street as youth led us in the youth climate movement. And people have been really suffering 6 years later and wondering what to do now that climate doesn't have the spotlight. And I really think it's our responsibility as a movement to make it the spotlight and really make those connections between our struggles with what people are struggling with now. So the affordability crisis, the attack on genderqueer and trans people, the attack on migrants, all of that is really live right now. And we don't ignore that just because it's not climate work, because if you really interrogated those connections, you would see how their liberation is so directly tied to the health and well-being of land and people. So encourage folks to keep making those connections and to keep that storytelling alive. But I'll leave it there and look forward to chatting more in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Janelle, for such leaving with such a beautiful picture in the end for your thoughts on transnational solidarity. I'm so honored to introduce the next speaker. Yomna Omer is a Sudanese Bachelor of Design and Architecture student at the University of British Columbia. She resides on the unceded and occupied lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations in British Columbia, and on the Blackfoot, Métis, and Stoney Nakoda, and the Tsuut'ina Nations in Alberta. Yomna is passionate about anti-colonial spacemaking and the creation of inclusive, sustainable communities through studies and work in architecture. She has a particular interest in vernacular architecture, critical regionalism, and exploring design solutions that center human resistance and cultural identity. Recently, her family has been directly affected by the ongoing war in Sudan and has since dedicated her Yomna has since dedicated her efforts to raising awareness and supporting those displaced by it. She works in solidarity with other colonially displaced diasporas through social media and campus initiatives. Thanks, Yomna, for joining us.
Hello, everyone. My name is Yomna Omer. I'm very happy and honored to be with you all here today. I'm a Sudanese student at UBC studying architecture in the Bachelor of Design program. I was born in the United Arab Emirates and my family moved to Canada in 2019, around the time that the revolution in Sudan was at its peak. Before I begin my story, I want to acknowledge that the land that I'm speaking from today is in Calgary, or so-called the city of Calgary, on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot, Métis, Stoney Nakoda, and Tsuut'ina Nations. As someone who comes from a place where land, displacement, and colonial histories shape everything, I want to recognize the deep Indigenous presence and stewardship of this land and the ongoing fight for sovereignty and justice here. A big part of who I am is my passion for anti-colonial spacemaking, especially in architecture. I try to focus on vernacular Indigenous forms of construction, looking at how people have built resilience through architecture and how our built environments hold cultural identity. Sudan is at the very heart of my story. It shapes who I am, how I see the world, and how I navigate it. And today I want to talk about what it means to carry that identity, to process ongoing war, colonialism, and climate change while trying to exist in a place that often doesn't see our struggles. So I would like to start talking about Sudan not from the perspective of war or tragedy, but from the richness of its people. Sudan is a country that sits in both East and North Africa. It's incredibly diverse, not just in landscape and climate, but in its people and culture. We have over 500 tribes speaking more than 100 languages and dialects. Sudan has always been a place of knowledge sharing, cultural exchange, and coexistence. But something I've thought about a lot is how colonialism disrupted that. Before the British, before the Ottomans, Sudanese people didn't sit around debating whether we're African or Arab or, all of these complex interconnected identities. We just existed as we are. It was colonialism that introduced these divisions, privileging certain groups over others, centralizing power in the capital city of Khartoum while neglecting the rest of the country. And that centralization, it's part of the reason why, when the war broke out in 2023, everything collapsed so fast. And so before I talk about the war, I want to talk about something much more important, which is the revolution. In 2019 and late 2018, Sudan rose up. It was one of the most beautiful, powerful moments in our history. People stood together, women, youth, marginalized communities, led the fight for freedom. And it wasn't just about removing a dictator, it was about reclaiming Sudan's future from decades of military rule, colonial remnants, and systemic oppression. The world saw images of people standing in the streets, singing, painting murals, lifting each other up in defiance. Over 1 million people would be at these marches, calling for peace, freedom, and justice. This is the Sudan that I know, one of resilience, unity, and hope. But Sudan's struggle didn't just start with this war. It started a long time ago, as I've mentioned. Remnants of colonialism, division imposed on us, and a long history of external interference shaping our suffering. And so all of these things, when combined, it ends up in a war breaking out in 2023. And it's often called the forgotten war by a lot of media outlets, but I want to make it clear that it's not forgotten. It is systemically ignored, and that erasure has everything to do with racism, with the way the world sees struggles from the global south as irrelevant, as background noise to global politics. The media barely covers it, international organizations fail to act, and yet behind closed doors, powerful nations continue to profit from Sudan's pain, from our minerals, from our resources, our instability. And Sudan is not just a war zone, it's a land of revolution, resistance, and history. Our fight is not just for survival, it's for justice, for dignity, for a future that we've been denied far, far too long. For those of us with family in Sudan, the war isn't just headlines, it's life. In the first days of the war, I found out that the central airport was bombed, which is just a couple blocks away from my family's house. Imagine being a student, having to exist in an academic environment, and at the same time, having to be on the phone 24/7 on edge, waiting for updates, making sure your family's still alive and safe. You hear about their evacuation, how they had to flee by land. My grandmother was stuck at the border for a whole week, trying to flee to safety to Egypt in unbearable heat, with barely any water or food resources. And you go through all of that, and you're still a student, you're still on campus, you're still expected to take finals, submit assignments, and just go about your day. The diaspora's life is expected to continue normally. And when someone asks, how are you? Like, there's no other way to explain all of this in a passing 1 or 2 sentences. So you just nod and say, yeah, all good. And this is why we need spaces where BIPOC students and those of us carrying those unbearable weights can actually talk, process, and support each other. These struggles may seem distant to some, but they're painfully close to home for us. And that's why interconnected solidarity matters. Because we aren't just observers of global injustice, we're living it, we're feeling it, and in whatever way we're trying to resist it. And so one of the hardest things about this war is how it silenced people. Internet blackouts made it impossible to know what's happening on the ground. We hear about massacres days later through small sources of information. And that's why being in the diaspora and using our voices is so important, because if we don't, no one else will. What made it worse was that when the war broke out, most international NGOs left. A lot of them that were on ground actively working before the war ended up leaving the moment that the war broke out. Anyone with a foreign passport got evacuated, and then Sudanese people were left behind to fend for themselves. And so who stepped in? It was the diaspora. It was those of us who lived outside of Sudan for generations and generations. We had to send in money to help people escape, to fund food aid, to keep people alive. And that's the thing. Sudan isn't suffering in isolation. The global north benefits from Sudanese gold, from Sudanese resources. But when we're being slaughtered, essentially, the world looked away. And so when we talk about climate injustice, we can't just talk about saving landscapes, plants, animals, and all other creatures and forget about people, because as Indigenous communities, you're part of these ecosystems. When the war displaced Indigenous communities, the knowledge that's been passed down for millennia is also lost. How to fight desertification, how to sustain the land, all of this information gets lost. The RSF militia has been systemically burning down entire fields of crop, worsening food insecurity. It's been strengthened and powered by all these foreign entities that are not from Sudan. So calling it a civil war to begin with is a mistake. Right now, 500,000 Sudanese children are at risk of starving to death, essentially, because of all these burning of crops and burning of fields. And the environmental impact doesn't stop there. There are thousands of decaying bodies in the streets of the city Khartoum, and I'm sorry if this is too harsh to hear, but it's the truth. Doctors have warned that diseases can spread from this and it will be catastrophic. And with the flooding season coming, the health crisis will only get worse, not to mention the infestation of rodents and stray dogs increasing as they roam freely in these unhygienic conditions. And so just to end it off, what's happening in Sudan isn't just about Sudan. It's part of a larger system of oppression that plays out pretty much the same way everywhere, whether it's Sudan, Palestine, Congo, or elsewhere. They use the same tactics of ethnic cleansing, resource theft, propaganda, forced displacement. And we, as people in the global north, we benefit from all of it. And that's why we have to show up for each other as students, as people in the diaspora. We need to be speaking in spaces where we support each other, where we speak up, where we refuse to let each other feel alone in these struggles. Because if the systems that oppressed us are interconnected, then our resistance has to be too. So I just want to leave you off with this, whatever you're fighting with, whatever you're standing up against, whether it's Sudan, Palestine, or elsewhere, or all of them combined, keep showing up, keep speaking out, and never underestimate the power of solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yomna. Yeah, Kaylee, if you're able to spell me. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much, Yomna, Aydana, Dani, and Janelle. I think, yeah, we might have just a couple more minutes, so I'm going to ask each of the panelists to say a few words in a second, but I think throughout the presentations, we could see how ongoing colonialisms, imperialisms are what created these systems that separated us from the land and from each other, whether that's through displacement, through residential schools, through internment camps. But international solidarities, sharing our stories, and cultural resistance is what really connects us in our anti-colonial struggles. And so I'm going to ask our panelists each to take about a minute and to share in a few words, what is your vision for climate justice and building transnational solidarities? Yeah. Is anyone ready to go first as well? And can Dani be spotlighted as well? And yeah, I can write the question in a chat, but yeah, also welcome everybody who's attending to also reflect on this for yourself. What is your vision for a climate just future and for transnational solidarities?
I can go. Yeah, I guess I would also, be remiss to not mention at this moment that, a Trumpian-led attack on DEI is happening. So an attack on doing this very thing of platforming and uplifting spaces where racialized folks get to tell these stories and build these relationships. And so if that's intentionally happening against us, it means that we need to be intentional about building the relationships to inaugurate ourselves against this. So my vision for climate justice is that we keep orientating ourselves as movement and people to those who have not yet joined us, and do the work to politically educate ourselves and others in order to build a movement strong enough against the corporate elite and billionaires who are using all sorts of distractions to keep us separated. And my hope is also that we are a bit delusional about hope. I think in this very moment, we spend a lot of time worrying about the rise of right populism and all the ways the world is going to get worse, without taking time to imagine and speak aloud the ways in which we think the world will get better. And I think that's really key to keep our political imaginations alive despite all odds. So encourage people to find ways to cultivate that hope and imagination.
Thanks, Janelle. And yeah, any of our other panelists, you can just unmute and share.
I think I can go next. I think for me, the biggest thing is to understand that we're all in this together. And as silly as cringe that the sentence might sound, but I truly believe that if these systems of oppression are learning from each other, are supporting each other, and all a struggle are interconnected, because if one system benefits from it, then the others do. Then we should do the same as people who are being oppressed. We should listen to each other and hear from each other's experiences. A lot of these revolutions that we hear about all over the world historically have had connections with other movements and connections with other movements of freedom, of revolutions, of the same thing pretty much. So I think the number one thing that gives me hope is hearing from others and hearing from even at UBC students who are going through something similar, and how we can support each other in that way. Having those circles where you feel safe to speak up and to share what you're going through is very important. And yeah, I can't imagine a toppling of capitalism or a toppling of all these systems of oppression if we're not united in it. But yeah, that's my answer.
Yeah, Dani or Dana, do you want to share any final words?
Yeah, I can just quickly say that I echo everything that's been said already. I think like as individuals, it's hard to conceive of what we can do. But I think detaching ourselves from like consumerism and like contributing to global capitalism as much as we can is so important, and constantly question where that desire to consume more comes from. I think we've all kind of been brainwashed into, thinking that that makes us feel good. And I think, I've also been complicit in that as well. But yeah, it's like destroying our environment. It's putting people in extremely precarious and awful working conditions. And yeah, global capitalism cannot exist without colonialism and occupation as well. Yeah.
Thanks. And I'll pass it to Dani if you have any final words.
Yes, okay, so this is like a very dense question for me because it makes me think of a lot of things. But I just want to start off with saying that what gives me hope, or what I think to first in regards to this question, is the definition of jouissance, which is defined in Blessed is the Flame, the book Blessed is the Flame, as an ecstatic energy felt but never captured that pushes us away from any form of domination, representation, or restraint, and compels us towards fierce wildness and unmitigated recalcitrance. It is the process that momentarily sets us free from our fear of death, and which manifests as a blissful enjoyment of the present, or a joy in which we cannot name. And I would encourage people to pursue that. And I would, in addition to that, I would encourage people to think about the ways in which they consider how they would go about climate justice efforts, and assess or like consider assessing if the hypothetical options that they are considering to pursue may be an instance of cruel optimisms. And I will define what cruel optimisms are by reading a quote to you all. Okay, so end quote, "For those in the Lagers, the dissolution of cruel optimisms was the most crucial step towards resistance. Immersed in a fog of misinformation, insidious lies, and unbearable truths, very few inmates managed to come to terms with the severity of their situations. And even fewer were able to muster the will, or had the luck, privilege, physical ability, etc., to act on those truths. Nihilism is the voice in the Warsaw Ghetto train station whispering, these trains are bound for an extermination center. It is the voice on the road to freedom whispering, these aren't showers. It is the voice in the Lagers definitively proclaiming, no one is going to save us. Some of the truths that nihilism asks of us to confront are almost as severe as and unbelievable as the truths about the camps. Groups like the CCF and the FAI ask us to accept the possibility that the majority of human beings on this planet will never be motivated to resist oppression. So, yeah, I would say that with this quote, it really, I really want y'all to sit with it. It is pulled from the book Blessed is the Flame. It has to do, or it regards camp resistance during Nazi Germany, which I think is very important to be looking to at this time, because everybody is thinking about how fascism is accelerating amongst us. And with that, it also makes me think that it is very important for us to be looking at past resistance efforts that could possibly educate us on how we will be moving forward. With that, a few case studies that come to mind, or like reactive, well, I'm going to divide this into two parts: reactive climate justice efforts and proactive/preventative climate justice measures. In regards to reactive climate justice efforts, I want to emphasize the mask block efforts, organizing efforts in LA Altadena that is happening presently and has been going on for a while now with the LA fires, being that mask blocks were leading the response to prevent people from breathing in toxic fumes with the fires that were basically uncontrolled and were not handled adequately by the government, but were the responsibility was just passed over onto civilians, organizers, most of which of mask block organizers are disabled, and also people who are incarcerated, who were forced to fight the fires because they don't really have any other choice. Additionally, I would want to point to the mask block organizing that was taking place last year in Atlanta, that was in response to the Biolab fire. It was Mask Block Atlanta, or ATL, that was fundraising and distributing gas masks to make accessible for the convoyers or convoyers. Yeah, convoyers. Sorry, I misread that. Being that there were large
Sorry to
plumes
interrupt.
of.
We had, because there's another event after this. Kaylee's telling me we have to move on, but I'd love if you could continue in the chat what you're describing. So sorry about that. But yeah, thank you again to all our panelists and for everyone for attending our event. I think, yeah, throughout the panel, we really was so grateful to hear from everybody's story. And what I'm really resonating with is that we grieve and we organize because we love the land and we love our community. And I think that is really what will bring us forward. But yeah, thank you everybody for attending our event, and to the panelists. We can set up a breakout room to debrief. But thank you so much everyone for attending.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Thanks to all the speakers on the panel for sharing your stories. What I was reflecting on was how all these stories and experiences really reflect the impact of an intersection with both climate change and well-being. These narratives touch on both climate and mental health, and link these with larger systems and requirements, community care and collective action to recognize how well-being should not and cannot be an individual piece. So reflecting on so much of what our speakers were saying we can't do this alone. We're in it together. We're all affected. So let's come together as communities.